Okay, it is the hour, so we will get started. So thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Jie Huang, an associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time today talking about the Tien visa requirements and answer the top questions that come up when preparing a Tien visa application. As many of you may know, the Tien visa is available for Canadian and Mexican nationals and can be one of the fastest ways you can get work authorization in the US. So just a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm. The founder, Ian Scott, is a Canadian national and has personal experience navigating the Tien visa, so we know exactly what you're going through. We assist individuals pursuing various types of visas, family-based, employment-based, E2s, including the Tien visa, and we regularly process a high number of Tien visas. We will be continuing this webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different immigration law topics, so please feel free to follow us. At the end of this webinar, we will send out a few things. First, we'll be providing a PowerPoint that has all the information that will be covered in this webinar. We will be sending you a Tien visa guide, which is a comprehensive guide you can use. We will also provide a link where you can sign up for additional webinars in the future, and also a link to this webinar as it will be recorded. So this webinar will be available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload videos on immigration law. So today we are lucky to have Kelly Legrand-Wiener, who is the managing attorney of the firm with a wealth of Tien visa experience, who will be answering these commonly found questions regarding the Tien visa. Finally, for any questions you may have as the presentation goes on, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A function to enter your questions, and we will get to all questions. So without further delay, let us move into our questions. All right, Kelly, good morning.
Good morning, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, so first question for you today is, has there been any changes to the free trade agreement, and has anything changed for Tien visas because of this?
So the free trade agreement, the name was changed. It used to be called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and now it goes by the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, so the USMCA. In terms of the changes to Tien visas, there really were not any. The substance that existed in NAFTA is basically exactly the same in the USMCA.
Right. Thank you for that. That's good to know. So let's dive into the Tien visa requirements. So first of all, could you give some example of some jobs and degrees that might qualify somebody for a Tien visa?
Sure. So for the Tien, there's actually a list. There's a specific list of, occupations that will qualify. And that list also contains kind of what degrees, the applicants need to have. And the requirement is that they be entering the U.S. to engage in this profession, and to, doing professional business duties. So some examples of occupations on the list, for example, accountant, if you have a baccalaureate, or you have a CPA, if you're a CA, a CMA, a CGA, those would all qualify. For an engineer, similarly, if you have a bachelor's degree, a baccalaureate in engineering, or another profession on the list would be dentist. If you have a DDS or a DMD, or one of the other, kind of doctorate degrees that you need to be a dentist.
Right. And are there any Tien visa job categories that requires experience rather than a degree?
There are a few. So for example, one popular one is the management consultant category. In this one, you can either have the baccalaureate or 5 years of experience in management consulting, or 5 years of experience in the field that's related to the consulting agreement that you have. There's also some other categories where you can have a post-secondary diploma or certificate plus 3 years of experience and also qualify. So for example, a graphic designer or an industrial designer, would qualify, excuse me, either under that bachelor's degree or the post-secondary diploma or certificate and 3 years of experience.
I see. So for the degrees, and this is a related question that commonly comes up, the wording in the regulations just mention a baccalaureate degree that's required. And now one question is, can the degree be in anything, right? For example, if the job description was for an accountant and the person obtained these skills through experience and say they have a diploma, but the degree is in a completely different field, such as engineering, would he or she be able to qualify?
So no. So this question does come up sometimes when people are trying to use alternative methods to qualify, because sometimes, someone gets a degree in one area, but then goes into a different field.
Right.
So for the Tien, however, that wouldn't work. So if you're going with, for example, you're an architect, which is one of the professions on the list, you have to have that baccalaureate or licenciatura in the particular in architecture or something related to architecture. So it's not, you're not going to be able to use that unrelated degree to qualify for the Tien, even if you have the work experience.
Right. So it seems like the important thing is that the degree is related to what you will be doing in the US.
Exactly. Like it may be, particularly for things like engineering, where sometimes there's various different degrees, like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. Now people sometimes have computer science degrees, which can substitute for
Right.
software engineering. So that's where you're going to look at the transcripts. You're going to look at what do the actual courses say. Sometimes for accountants, sometimes they might have a business degree with a concentration in finance. So
Right.
it's not always going to be that you're an architect, you have an architecture degree, you're an accountant, you have an accounting degree. There might be different, kind of terms, but ultimately then you'll have to look at the transcript and make sure that you can make an argument that, it's aligned enough that it's really the degree is related to the profession.
Definitely. Okay, so another question that we have related to this is, does the degree have to be from a US university, right? And if it is from a foreign university, if my degree is from a Canadian or Mexican university, do we need a credential evaluation?
Right. So if, it can be from a US university, but it doesn't have to be. And it can also be from, really can be a degree from anywhere. If it's not a US degree and not a Canadian or Mexican degree, then you need the credentials evaluation.
Right.
Generally, if it is a Canadian degree or Mexican degree, the regulations kind of, specifically account for those two types of degrees, and we'll consider those, as meeting the qualifications. But let's say you're Canadian, but, you were educated in Europe, you're going to need to have a credentials evaluation of your education done.
Yeah, that is a very helpful distinction, right? So if you have a Canadian degree, then you actually don't need any evaluation at all.
Correct.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about green cards, because one of the questions that we get a lot is, does the Tien visa eventually lead to a green card?
Right. And I think this is, this is a common kind of misconception about many non-immigrant visas. So
Right.
no, a TN doesn't lead to a green card the way that, just because you're on an H-1B or an L-1, those don't kind of lead to a green card. For all those categories, if you are eligible for a green card while you're on that visa, you can apply for it. With the H and the L, it's a little easier because those are what we call dual intent visas. So that's where you can have a green card petition pending and be on the visa, and there's no issue with renewals or travel. For the Tien visa, let's say that you're here on a Tien and your employer wants to sponsor you for an EB3 green card. They can certainly do that. They can go ahead and start that process for you while you're on the Tien. The thing to consider that's a bit different than the H and the L is the Tien is not dual intent. So that means that once certain parts of the green card application are filed, so once the I-140 is filed, or once the I-485 green card petition is filed, at that point, you're going to struggle or really not be able to renew your Tien visa. And at certain points in the process, travel might be restricted for you if you're on the Tien. So does the Tien lead to a green card? No, in the way that, for all other non-immigrant work visas, there's no kind of direct, like automatic, I've been here for this number of years, now I get a green card, but you can apply while you're on the Tien.
Right. And it will be it would be very important to know that the TN visa is not a dual intent visa. So once a green card application or any part of the green card application has been filed, you'll need to consult with an experienced attorney to exactly know how your status will change.
Exactly.
And a very similar related question is there any limit to how many times one can apply for a TN visa?
So there isn't, the H-1B and the L, for example, the H-1B, you can only renew up to 6 years. And then you can extend only if you have a green card petition pending. The L, you can only go up to 7 years on an L1A or 5 on an L1B. It's a real benefit to the TN. The TN can be renewed in 3-year increments indefinitely. For Mexican nationals, and you can get the visa for 1 year at a time, but there's no limit on the number of times you can get the TN. The only thing to consider is that the TN does require a showing of non-immigrant intent. So that means you do actually need to retain ties to your home country. So if you have property that you own, in Canada or Mexico, or you have deep family ties there, you have retirement accounts, things like that. So if you, for example, have been with the same company for, you're going on 9 years, 12 years, once you get to that higher amount, you may start to get more questions on this. What are your ultimate plans? Do you intend to stay in the US full time? So those are things that can come up that you want to consider. When you've been on a TN for that long, if you've been on a TN for 12 years, maybe you want to stay in the US, maybe you want to think about trying to transition to an H-1B or something like that. But ultimately, let's say you got a TN and then you worked in Canada for several years, now you want to come back, there's no limit. You can, continue to have the TN, without any limitations.
Certainly. Okay. So now that we've discussed a little bit about the requirements, why don't we move on to the next category of questions, which is regarding sponsorship. And I think it is a common misunderstanding with regards to, does a TN visa require sponsorship, right? So we can dive right into it. So Kelly, do you find that employers understand that TN visas is a category that do not require sponsorship?
I think they don't understand it. It's actually something that's come up quite a bit, and we've definitely had clients come to us. Some who even asked us to kind of write letters to their employers explaining what is the TN visa, what is their obligation, what do they have to do. Ultimately, kind of when a Canadian is applying at a port of entry, or the Mexican national is going to the consulate, all the employer really needs to provide is that job offer. So they're providing a letter that explains, here's the terms of the job. So, for example, this person is an accountant. We're hiring them as an accountant. Here's the terms. Here's what we're paying them. We'd like to hire them in this temporary position for, up to 3 years. And that's really all the employer is kind of obligated to do. I think that it's really not clear to most employers. They always have in their mind kind of the H-1B, which has a lot of requirements, prevailing wage requirements, location requirements, compliance, requirements with the Department of Labor. So I think that when they first hear about the TN, they kind of lump it in with the H-1B. They don't really understand. It really doesn't have those extra requirements. I'd say the only time when the TN could kind of be more going on quasi sponsorship almost is when the person's in the United States and the employer is filing what's called a form I-129 for them and doing a change of status or extension of status. When they're doing that, that I-129 petition is considered a company petition. There is a filing fee the company pays to the government. So, I think at that point, it starts to look a little bit more like sponsorship. But even then, it's not the same as the H-1B. There's not a prevailing wage requirement. If the person is working out of a San Francisco office and changes to the Los Angeles office, there's really not a requirement that any, amendments be made as there would with an H-1B. So I think it's something that employers really don't understand, but is really key, I think, for, applicants to advocate for themselves, because, I think once employers do understand that it's really just this job offer letter that complies with the TN requirements, they're often much more willing to, to go ahead with it.
Right. And we are happy to provide opinion letters to the employers to explain that process. So I guess in both scenarios, either the consular or border processing or the USCIS, can an employee pay for their own TN filing, or does the employer have to pay?
So in this case, the employee can pay. There are some cases like green card perm filings or parts of the H-1B process where by regulation it's not allowed for the employee to pay. That's not the case with the TN. It's just not nearly as kind of heavily regulated as some of these other visas like the H-1B. So that's another benefit that the employee themselves, if they want legal advice, if they want to hire a lawyer, they can pay themselves for for the fees related to the TN.
Definitely. And is there a requirement to show that the company cannot find a US person to fill the job?
So no, there is no requirement. I think this is a common misunderstanding about a lot of temporary work visas. This question comes up a lot. So, testing the labor market is not required for the TN. It's much more, that's really something that happens more in the perm green card process or for certain H-1B employers that have, have particular issues. But as a general rule, you do not need to test the labor market for H-1Bs, and you don't need to do it ever for TNs.
And are there any minimum wages the TN worker has to be paid?
There aren't, other than you have to abide by all kind of federal and state minimum wage laws. So, as the employer, you need to be, abiding by those laws. But in regards to kind of the immigration regulations, there's no kind of prevailing wage minimum that you have to meet. Something to keep in mind, though, is that the wage, the salary or the pay arrangements do have to be explicitly disclosed in the letter that's provided to, to CBP or to the consulate. So if it's not an appropriate wage for a professional position, that may be questioned. So if you say I'm hiring a doctor for $7 an hour, I think, that's really not gonna work out for you anywhere. So it does need to make sense in terms of, and it is in the regulations that you have to disclose that. So it should make sense in light of the type of position, but it's not the same as the H-1B where you actually have to, pay a certain wage or face, Department of Labor penalties.
All right. So switching gears a little bit. So if the TN application is filed from within the US, and I think we briefly mentioned this a little earlier, can the person start working right away as soon as the application is filed?
No, they cannot. So, that's a benefit you get sometimes with the H-1B. If you're here on an H-1B and you meet certain requirements and you file your petition to port to a new employer, you can start once that's filed. It's not the case for a TN. For the TN, you actually will have to wait for your approval before you can start working.
Right. And that'll be a different story if the person leaves the US and then comes in and does another border application or a consular application.
Right. So if you're coming in, through the border, you're coming in through the consulate with a visa, you can start working right away.
Right.
Once you enter the US on the TN.
Okay. So now let us shift gears and talk about differences for Canadian and Mexican nationals in regards to the TN visa. Okay, so in both countries, are TNs currently being processed, and has there been any issues due to COVID?
Right. So TNs are currently being processed for Canadians and for Mexican nationals. I think over the past couple of years, there absolutely have been impacts due to COVID. I think for Canadians, it's been a bit less. What we see there is that you may want to call ahead to the port where you're entering. During COVID, particularly, some places started having kind of appointments. I'd say that's kind of not the standard at a lot of ports. So you really just want to call ahead and ask, will they want you to come during a particular time? Often they'll, recommend certain times during the day or to not come on the weekends, when there may not be as experienced of an officer or it's busier. So, COVID has impacted both, Canadians. I think the biggest issue is just call ahead to find out, if they're going to make you come during a certain time. For Mexican nationals, I think it's been a bit worse just because consulates are very delayed for all visa processing. And a lot of consulates in Mexico really handled a lot of the overflow from other countries that were shut down. So that kind of led to a lot of delays. And I think we're still seeing delays of a few months at many of the consulates in Mexico for TN visa processing. Something to keep in mind is if you have had a TN before, you may be eligible for an interview waiver where you can just kind of send in your documents and get your passport back. So that's kind of one way to circumvent some of the delays with the, with the lack of a appointment availability. But so both of them, TNs are currently being processed. And I think the issues from COVID are certainly much less now, than they were even say a year ago.
Right. And for each country, so how long before the start of the TN job can a TN applicant apply for the TN and come to the US?
So you can enter the US 10 days prior to the start of your TN. So that to say, if you're Canadian, you're coming to the border, you're going to be entering that day. So you don't want to be applying more than 10 days prior to what's on the job offer letter for your start date. For Mexican nationals, obviously, it's going to take a bit longer to get your biometrics and your visa appointments. You can kind of start that process faster or sooner, ahead of your start date. And similarly, once you get your visa, it's not going to be granted, until the earliest would be 10 days prior to your start date.
I see. So you can start the visa application and preparation process months before, but one thing to note is once you get the visa, you will enter the US less than 10 days before the start date of the job.
Exactly. And I think
Right.
sometimes we have Canadian clients that might want to kind of get the visa and then go right back to Canada. So they want to get it just kind of out of the way, which makes sense. But if you go prior to 10 days, to the start date that's in your offer letter, they're not going to let you in. So that's something to keep in mind.
Very important distinction. So, okay. So another question that we get is how many days after the TN expires can a TN holder stay in the US?
So you're not allowed to stay past your I-94 end date. Like whatever is on your I-94 end date, you shouldn't stay past that date. That being said, sometimes what will happen is the officer, when they stamp you to come in on your I-94, they'll give you an additional 10-day grace period on the end of, so like if you're, the end date of your employment was October 18th, they might stamp you until October 28th. You still should not work during that 10-day grace period. You should still stop on the date that, is on your job letter or your visa. But if the I-94 end date, they gave you that 10-day grace period, you can certainly stay here for that length of time.
Then in that case, I think it would be really important for the applicant to always be checking what the end date of their I-94 is as they come into the US, right?
Absolutely. I think this is something that we try to drill into our clients because it really can have huge impacts on you if you don't know your I-94 end date. And you stay past that date and there's not a reasonable ability to get it corrected by Customs and Border Patrol, it really you'll accrue unlawful presence. It can lead to bars to the US. So always, 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 always check your I-94 when you enter. Particularly for Canadians, I think when you enter, sometimes officers, particularly if it's a land border, will just send you in as a tourist. And so we have some clients who, have work visas, but when they've come in, they're actually stamped as tourists, or in B status. And when they check their I-94, they realize, unless they can get that corrected, there's some period of time out of status. So it's really, really key to check every single time. Because even though it may be an error on Customs and Border Patrol's part, there's sometimes limited ability to get them to fix it, particularly at a land border. So you want to check as soon as you enter the US so you can kind of fix it right away.
And you can check it online, right? On the I-94 website.
You can. You should be able to check it on the I-94 website. And there's a great website and you should absolutely use it. And, and then contact a deferred inspection office right away if there's any issues with your I-94.
A very important point. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the TN application process. So what if a job requires a license? For example, if you're an attorney, you will need a license to practice in the United States. Does the TN applicant have to have the license at the time of applying for a TN?
So no, they actually don't. There's a particular memo on this that's very helpful. And sometimes we even send our clients to the border with it, just in
Mhm.
case they encounter an officer who's not familiar with it. So having a license is not mandatory at the time of entering the U.S. If your particular job does require the license before, you can practice, then it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that you're meeting, that compliance requirement. But as long as you have the degree and the ability to kind of do the professional duties, you'll be allowed into the US, even if you don't have the license at the time you apply.
Right. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of applying at USCIS within the US versus a port of entry, which is really for Canadian nationals, right?
Yeah, so I think that the benefits of a port of entry are it's very fast. You're going to get your answer right away. The officer's going to look at your documents and either kind of approve you or you can withdraw or they'll deny you. There's minimal documents needed. Really, you need your passport, the proof of your degree or your experience, and your job offer letter. You can apply at any port of entry, so there's a lot of kind of options there. Some port of entries are even optimized for faster TN processing, so you can kind of choose to go to one of those, and the fees are very minimal. When you're going through that route, if you go through USCIS, you're doing a change of status or extension of status. I'd say that the compliance requirements are a bit more onerous. There's also a $460 filing fee. And then if you want premium processing, there's another $2,500 fee. So if you want to get an answer quickly and not within several months, you have to pay significantly more than you would, going to the border. Additionally, I think we often will see USCIS, there's certain categories that are just highly scrutinized, and those can be scrutinized, at any port of entry as well. But I think USCIS, particularly for people like economists and management consultants, they can expect a difficult time at the port of entry too, but I think an even more difficult time with USCIS. I think if you're going to a port of entry or even if you're going to a consulate, you have the ability to advocate for yourself. You're having a conversation with the officer about your background, how it fits, what the nexus is. I think that when you're going with USCIS, all you can do is kind of provide written material, and it can sometimes be harder to get those risky cases through.
Right. And another related question that I had was if you do the change of status through USCIS or an extension of status through USCIS, when you leave the country, right, when you come back, what will happen?
So ultimately, like you can present your approval notice to the, Customs and Border Patrol, but they could also, they basically could challenge it and
Mhm.
essentially re-adjudicate it at the border.
Right.
So they're not terribly consistent about it. And so just because you got your, economist approval through USCIS and now you're going through the border, you could be, questioned on it, and you could
Mhm.
essentially be asked to provide a new application for them to reapprove you. So that can also be, an issue with a USCIS filing.
Right. The ability to travel in and out of the country. Yeah. Another consideration for applicants. Okay, so the last category of questions that we have today are some tips and common TN visa pitfalls. Okay, so one question that we do get a lot is, what if I want to change a job once I am in the US? Do I need a new TN visa for that?
So you do, yes. It's not possible to, kind of just what, you're an accountant at one firm and now you're an accountant in another firm. That's fine. You could be eligible through both, but you will need to, go back to the border, go back to the consulate, or submit an amendment with USCIS before you can start working at that new job.
Right. And it's very important to remember that the TN visa is tied to that specific employer that you initially applied for. So you do need a new TN if you're going to work somewhere else. Another question is, can a TN worker bring his or her family into the US? Which family members? And can the spouse of a TN visa holder work or study in the US?
So a TN worker can bring their family, they can bring their spouse and any unmarried children under 21, and they would get what's called a TD visa. One thing that I think that's important to remember is that Canadians are visa exempt. So Canadian families could all go to the border and get the TN and the TD visas together. If your spouse is not Canadian, they will have to go get a visa. Like they'll actually have to submit a DS-160 application and a visa application and go to the consulate and get a visa. So that's just something to keep in mind. If they don't have Canadian citizenship, they won't be visa exempt, and you'll have to get your TN first, and then they'll have to go get their visa at the consulate. Your spouse and your children can study in the US. Unfortunately, your spouse cannot work. So that is a limitation for spouses. There's other visas like the E2, or the L visa where the spouse can work. Unfortunately for the TN, the spouse cannot work.
Very important distinction there as well. Okay, so that is all of the questions that I had for you today. And let us see if there has been any questions from the audience. Oh, there has been quite a bit of questions. Okay, let's go through them. So first question, what if the degree is from a Quebec university in French? Should it be translated?
So I think this depends on, so generally, yes, I think that, let's say if you're applying with USCIS, they're absolutely going to require a translation. If you're crossing in Montreal, they might not, but you don't want to take that risk. So I think that the safe bet is going to be yes, you should have it translated for them.
Agreed. Can TN visa holders work for employers other than the employer for whom TN was applied? I believe we already answered that question, and the answer is no. You do need a new TN in order to do so.
You also could, one other thing to mention is you can get concurrent TNs.
Right.
So let's say like you're working for one person and, there's another company that wants to hire you part-time. You can go back to the border and just get a second TN approval, but you do have to get that second approval.
Right. And another thing that we that we do get is does a part-time arrangement qualify for the TN visa arrangement? And the answer is yes, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So you can get a TN visa for a part-time work arrangement. Will Canadians get a social security number for the USA once the TN is approved?
So yes, you basically once you enter the United States, you would go to the Social Security Administration and you'd submit an application showing your work authorized status. And because of that work authorized status, you would be eligible to get your Social Security number.
Yeah, that is exactly correct. What happens if the job title is not exactly the same as the one mentioned in the USMCA? For example, one of the titles for the TN visa is Computer Systems Analyst, but someone who works in the same role in a hospital receives the job title Clinical Systems Analyst. So in that case, will the border officer reject the visa?
So no, not like I think not necessarily. Like it's very common that we have clients, that come, not every accountant's job title is accountant,
Right.
some of them finance consultant or, controller or something like that. So there's lots of different titles that can apply. I think the key is that the job offer letter has to make clear how that role of clinical systems analyst actually meets the requirements for what a computer systems analyst is. And for that, they're often going to look at something called the OOH, the occupational handbook from the Department of Labor that kind of talks about what does each particular job do. So they're not going to reject the visa automatically just because the titles don't match. But if the titles don't match, or it's, I'd say computer systems analyst can sometimes be one of those more high risk categories, you do have to do more in the letter to really advocate to show that the position meets that requirement.
Yeah, and the way you would do that is to really go into the job descriptions and the duties of what you will be doing on the ground to really show that it matches the descriptions in the OOH of what computer systems analysts usually would do.
Absolutely.
All right. So I believe we went through all the questions today, both from me and both from the audience. If there is no other outstanding questions, I think we could close out today.
Sounds great.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm sure this was very helpful for a lot of our audience. And everybody, thanks for joining us today again. And we're Scott Legal PC. Please feel free to follow us for more webinars in the future.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.